welcome back. That was a bit of good grub, wasn't it? Amazing. Cake? I said don't give them cake at this time. I said just give them food. Well, I saw there was cake there as well. People getting sleepy. Well, you won't be sleepy because Yesid is going to, you're inviting Yesid to speak to us now. So I'm really pleased to introduce Yesid Paez from University. And his talk, Reimagining Local Museums, Avenues for Community-Based Peace Building in Colombia. And I'll just go through the little intro that you've also got in the programme. So Yesid Paez is a senior lecturer in education at University, specialising in peace building education and international development, but does have his heart in Liverpool. So Yesid worked in Liverpool with my colleague here, iJADE. Yesid's got over 20 years of experience in education, particularly in TESOL and international development. Dr. Paez's research explores the role of education in peace building, including social movements and alternative educational spaces. He's published on peace education initiatives and continues to examine how communities leverage public spaces for conflict resolution and social change. Yesid is currently focused on projects that investigate innovative avenues for peace building through community engagement and education. So can you welcome Yesid?
So it's good to know that you have cake, so if you fall asleep, I'm going to get in the cake. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here today, and I'm going to share with you my journey and the learning that I have done these years exploring peace building education. And particularly this time it's going to be about local museums of memory and peace, but at the same time how those spaces are connected to other sort of educational sites. So let's start. So Colombia has had a history of intractable conflict, more than 70 years. So it means, for example, moments in cities, big cities, Medellin, Bogota, in the 80s and the 90s. I was a child, and I remember, news about that sort of, that sort of events happening regularly, but also, images of people kidnapped, like soldiers kidnapped in the jungle, and a lot of, difficult events in connection to the conflict, and it's a conflict that has been rooted in inequality, in lack of avenues for participation, political participation, land ownership, and a fight between two political parties that until today more or less remains the same. We have made good progress, but still a long way to go. So I'm going to talk about two sort of different spaces when we think of peace and we think of memory. And what we have now is essentially those sort of spaces. So we have the center, the National Center for Memory, and a local one in Bogota, which is common sometimes because there are places where you have narratives of conflict or history. And sometimes what happens is that one place, which is national sometimes, which is always the case, right? When we tell stories, right, we make choices, and some of the stories are not told. So that is somehow an issue that we have, right? And sometimes in response to that, what we have is different centers trying to deal with alternative stories, or stories that are more localized in terms of the experience of conflict. But we also have social movements that have become stronger in the last 20, 30 years. And we also have digital spaces where ideas about peace, national identity, or the coming of the conflict are put, right? And we can have access to them. So in 1985, we had a difficult, terrible event, I would have to say. So the guerrilla group took the Palace of Justice, and then the government tried to recover the place, and people who were rescued at the time disappeared, so they were killed, and it was a crime committed by the state. And only until now do we have more precise information about it, because at the time we were not allowed to investigate, we were not allowed to know what happened really, so we already know that it was the state behind this. And then we have Doris Salcedo, an artist, who decided to start creating performances to actually promote this idea of we need to come up with versions of that story, right? We need to think about that, we need to prompt reflection. And this installation is called November the 6th and 7th, which is basically, these days we're commemorating this again, the story of what happened. But actually what this is prompting is, it's hinting the absence of collectively articulate versions of what happened. So we didn't have any of that. Not at a national level, anyway. And then we also have Fragmentos by Doris Salcedo. This is a very interesting museum in Bogota where, after the peace agreement in 2016, very contested as well, it was a similar situation to what happened here with Brexit. And it was a referendum voting for peace, and more or less 53% said, no, we don't want peace, and 48% said, well, we want peace, and then it was young people mobilizing and saying, wait a minute, we really want peace, we want to move on, we need to move forward. And it was essentially, well, a failure in democracy for us as a nation, but at the same time, the task to do it anyway, right? So you can imagine the complexity around the whole process, what it means, and the processes that took place afterwards. With Fragmentos, all the weapons that the guerrilla gave up, well, they melted them, and so Doris created tiles, and the women who have been affected by the conflict started hammering those tiles, right, and telling the stories, and channeling the anger and the frustration and everything that happens when you're a victim, or when we are victims of conflicts, of course. But this time was a job that was done by women. Women who for a long time have been silenced, but at the same time have struggled on in the face of oppression and conflict in many ways. So we have memory then, we have social mobilization, we have initiatives taking place at the national level on the side of the arts, museums, literature, music, so we have all of that, right? In our history there is a lot of cultural production, and we're trying to depict what that was about. But then the question remains, as I said at the beginning, what happens with those stories, with those narratives, with those experiences that remain marginalized and localized? And that's why we're going to Putumayo, to the south of Colombia. An extraordinary region. It's jungle, basically, it's the Amazon. And it has had a very particular history in terms of conflict. It has been, the natural resources and the geography has been a blessing, but it has also been a curse. So we can identify moments throughout history of the Republic in which conflict and violence has evolved, fueled by particular characteristics. So we have the violence, which is the struggle, the fighting, the confrontation between two political parties. Then with the consolidations of some armed groups, because we at the time had 4-3, we have had many peace agreements as well, and the lesson that we get from this is that it never works because there are people who benefit and there are sectors who benefit from the conflict. So this is the tension that still we have. A government a few years ago openly said we're going to destroy the peace agreement and we're going to bring it into ashes. That is the promise, and that has been the commitment. So we have then the oil. It's a region that has a lot of oil, so there is a lot of exploitation, but they don't get the benefit of it, right? They don't profit from it. It's just the centralized government, and still these people and these communities remain somehow marginalized. Then we have the coca production, and very rich soil that produces apparently good quality coca. And it grows really fast. And if you have to choose, as someone who lives in the countryside, between growing fruit or vegetables that take time, you don't have infrastructure to trade them, or coca, you don't even have to move, right? You just have to grow it. It grows quickly, and then somebody will come and pick it up. Well, clearly you need a choice, right? Definitely. And then with that, we have armed groups, particularly the guerrilla and the paramilitary. So we have a very complex situation here. Uslenda, who's an academic from Northern Ireland, by the way, has worked on this conflict, and he has theorized something that's interesting, which is the geographies of terror. Because what we have, the experience of the conflict is different depending on the geography. In Colombia, within the country, I would dare to say that we have 5 different countries because of geography, because of cultural characteristics as well. So I found, yeah, he theorized and he understood the existence of a parallel state. So it was the guerrilla sometimes doing mediation between communities, for example, imposing order, altering economic activities, as did the paramilitary, of course. So it has been, and sometimes the communities get in the middle of all that confrontation and that messiness of the conflict. But then what I found, and this took me a while, because I wanted to do research, and initially I thought, being in academia, I wanted to prove to yourself that you know and that you're going to do a good job. So I said, well, I want to do something connected to metaphors of peace, coming from a linguistic background. But then what I found there was radically different and extraordinary. Not romanticizing, but understanding the big lessons that you can get from those contexts. So I found spaces of peace. Spaces of peace in the middle of conflict, in the middle of violence, in the middle of confrontations. And those spaces of peace were created in educational sites. And that is schools, but not only. We have libraries, and we have museums, and other forms of social organization. That's how we're connected to those places. Those understandings and those conceptualizations of peace produce practices. Right? As I say to my students, depending on the idea that you have with students, that's going to be your practice, that's going to be your pedagogy. Right? So that's strictly connected. So then, before we get to know the Museum of Memory and Peace, perhaps it is good to reflect a little bit on the concept of memory. So one of the things we said at the beginning is that when we tell a story in this particular context, in context of conflict, that story is going to be listened to, but there are going to be other stories that perhaps are going to be in the periphery, right? Going to be marginalized, and this is the case. So this is an interesting concept because it's quite contentious. So much that, for example, a few years ago in the National Historical Center for Memory, the director said there hasn't been any conflict here in Colombia. What are you talking about? And then the communities who have organized and have been very proactive in trying to collect all the stories, the narratives of the conflict, had to remove them from the archives in order to preserve the stories, because it's truth we're talking about. But then, what is memory? Well, memory essentially is a mechanism that allows us to interrogate the way in which we experience the past. What is our interpretation of that past in connection to the present and also in connection to the future? So sometimes, when we talk about museums, the critique or perhaps the assumption is that it is museums are deeply connected with the past and not the future. I think that's changing, and that is changing at a local level, right? Because by remembering, you make choices. You choose what to remember, how, and what to forget, and why. So those are your choices. People also understand that after the Holocaust, and some theorists mentioned there was a boom in terms of memory. So Germany, for example, has a lot of work on memory. The United States, right, Europe in general, but Germany is one of those places where memory has this big reception. And people from Latin America, particularly, go there, and there are lots of studies in connection to the arts and memory and literature and so on and so forth. So it is a subjective process as well, but that subjectivity finds all the subjectivity. So it means my story, your story, we make sense of what happened together. And it happens within a cultural framework. So the memory that, the way people construct memory in Colombia is different from the way they do it in Argentina. Right? They have particular characteristics of how to do it, right? It's because they have this context, the history, they have the conditions, the political situations and so on. Well, so this is this is a picture of the museum. So it's quite rudimental, and a little bit of the story of this is it was a school, primary school, and it got trapped in the middle of a confrontation between the paramilitary and the guerrilla. So children went to study, and then all of a sudden they had to protect themselves because there were shootings happening during school time. Then of course they had to leave, right, because it was dangerous. But then when the conflict somehow finished, at least in that sort of way, this place is abandoned, and then the people there said, well, we think this is a place where we can actually try to do something, right, to teach people about what happened. So it constitutes itself as a first avenue of collection of artifacts and the generation of some narratives, because we had at the time we had an office for victims, which provided some money, and I think it still does. And it was good because sometimes, as we're going to see when we talk about peace, those communities need the help, the assistance of organizations, of the government, of non-governmental organizations as well, of different people, and that helps create those spaces where those stories are going to be presented, where you're going to have the artifacts telling stories and inviting to make reflections. So what we see here is the story of children, essentially, right? So how children use this space, use their space, receiving an education. It's very green, because that's their reality. It's green everywhere. It says here, hacer memoria es el camino a la no repetición. They understand the importance of memory as a way for non-repetition. And that's how it starts. And it starts with the collaboration of priests, somehow collecting. Then there is a moment in which other priests say, and particularly one says, well, this is not a good idea, we shouldn't have these artifacts, we should get rid of them. So there is, and this is important as well, I didn't mention, but there is contestation in the sense that when we create memory, there are tensions in terms of maybe we shouldn't remember this, maybe this is not useful, maybe remembering this is going to be a way to get stuck, as some people might think. So this is a uniform of the paramilitary, right? And they have, so if, I don't know if you've noticed, but Sweden, for instance, was providing some assistance to do that. So there is an action, there is an act of hybridity, so hybrid work around peace. I will explain that in a moment. So then the other concept we have is peace, and we have talked about peace quite a lot today, right? And peace, what is peace? And this is one of those things I started thinking about when I started my PhD, and well, there is no single definition. And sometimes even the word peace is very problematic. Think about Lebanon these days, and even before, the word peace is complicated because it reminds of oppression, Western oppression, or words related to peace can be a little bit problematic in some contexts. So reconciliation in Argentina is alright, but maybe they do not like the word as much as other words like truth or memory, whereas in Colombia everybody talks about reconciliation. So it's a word that people like. We need it. It's right. We really feel that that's something we need. Which doesn't mean that in Argentina there isn't, or that in Lebanon there are no opportunities for peace. It's about a cultural translation, right? So peace can be many things. It can be solidarity, it can be citizenship, and you have to quite a lot of that. It can be compassion, critical compassion, there's a lot of that as well. It can be, well, many things. But what happens most of the times is that understanding peace has been taken from top-down approaches, which is documents from the United Nations and impositions of the victors, agenda. So after the Holocaust and the Second World War, we have this proliferation of studies of peace, conflict resolution, conflict mediation, and so on and so forth. And now we have a huge variety of approaches to do peace, which is good, it's great, it works. But sometimes the failure here is that those approaches come from perspectives that have nothing to do and little knowledge of the realities of people. Plan Colombia was one of them. Plan economy was money sent from the United States that returned to the United States, that imposed changes economically speaking, and imposed economic activities that people were not familiar with. And this is one of those examples. It's the jungle. So having cows is not something that works well in that context, right? But it has disrupted, the ecosystems, economic activities, and the cultural landscape of the region. What does it mean today then? Well, it means that we work depending on the context, depending on the resources we have, right, and how we understand, the challenges of the situations, essentially. We have hybridity, which is basically sometimes local communities have initiatives, and Germany does a lot of that as well. It's like, well, you as a community, what do you need, what do you want, how do you understand your needs and your processes, and based on how to provide some assistance and some financial help. The point with that is that it is not something that stays for, that lasts for a long time. So, for instance, this museum has that issue, and the library that I'm going to talk about in a bit, is that they have some money sometimes, they have some assistance, but then it stops. And then, and they have to make do with what they have. And so it makes things a little bit slow, right? This is a local library, and I quite like the idea of thinking of the aesthetics of this building, because there is this, right? Particular one of understanding beauty and understanding their own identities and their own processes. And now we think about education as something that would complement this. And we have talked about quite a lot about education as well in the sessions very productively. But I also tell my students very often, we need to be careful and we need to be suspicious as well. Because we tend to think of education as a powerful tool for transformation, and it is. But it can also be the opposite. Right? So education has these two phases, and sometimes when there is absence of education, when in education we have spaces where children are indoctrinated, where I remember John saying, they identified the school as one of those places that probably did nothing. So, if we don't talk about things, if we don't care, right, if we perpetuate images of the other as another that's not human, for instance, and we see that stays, well, then clearly education has part of the responsibility here. And then, well, 3 forms of education, and I think this is interesting because by understanding this, and I know we do understand that, but thinking education is formal, schools, universities, but it is also informal. It has to do with the way we live and how we learn in our daily lives, but also how those processes of social struggle and inequality constitute also avenues for education and for knowledge production. Now, thinking about this, we also need to understand something, that in policies, that in social media, that in media in general, there is also an educational dimension. And perhaps not a very positive one, right? How many times have we, in the morning seen images of children beheaded, or violence and killings, and it is becoming naturalized, right? It is becoming something for the everyday consumption. So what's the meaning of that then? Because we have talked about meaning quite a lot today, and I think it's quite relevant and revealing meaning it is. So those avenues are participating in destruction of humanity of others. So we need to engage with that in peace education and in peace building. Because it is there, because it is challenging, and because it is delivering a message. Well, again, we have the library. We have young people working in the library as volunteers, children and young people who go and have these interesting activities and relations with others, and then they go to university, and sometimes they come back. Most of the times they come back and they decide to do politics and decide to do interesting activities like a magazine, for instance. They have created a magazine where people have the opportunity to express, maybe write poems, do photography. So then the library, the local library, becomes a place where everybody is welcome, right? Where there is production of knowledge somehow, where there is opportunity for expression, where everybody is invited. But there is only one condition. no violence. So then the ethos of the place is quite strong and educates. This is part of the school. So the schools, as such, we can do peace education, and peace education is fundamental because not everybody experiences conflict like people in Northern Ireland or Colombia or so many other places, right? But then schools need to mobilize. And this is the case in iJADE. So they mobilize, it means they create, for example, groups of theater, they do sports, they do different activities outside the schools, even in the middle of, risking their jobs or, because think about this, sometimes they mobilize, and in times of oppression when the conflict was, heavy, well, the paramilitary or the guerrilla were like, well, what are they doing? But because maybe they were part of the library or the school, somehow they had a little bit of freedom to navigate those complex spaces. So they were able to promote alternatives. This was more so in the case of the library. What we have here is the commemoration of a massacre. So you see there is paintings. This idea we will remember, and we have decided to move on. So it's women carrying out initiatives of memory and reparation. And there is something interesting here as well, which is they have organized in particular ways because they have seen and they have understood that the state is also violent against them. There is structured violence. So if women and families are displaced, then when there is time for restitution of land, the one who gets the land is the man, not the woman. Right? So we have a serious issue there, and that's why they have organized, they have created an enterprise, they have consolidated funds to understand in their position as women, and also advocate for liberation of people who have different sort of gender expressions and sexualities. So it's very active, and the role of women in particular in Latin America, I would have to say, is very critical. I'm not saying it is in other places, but this is what I have witnessed. So here we go. We have the Museum of Peace and Memory. So they are making sense of those stories. They are incorporated. So I have visited this quite a few times, and at the very beginning they do have this present and past and future. I was talking to a colleague yesterday, and we were talking about the Museum of the Future in Dubai, and how wonderful it is, and the depiction of a world in which the man controls everything and technological advances are, unprecedented and fantastic. But at the same time, we still have issues of inequality and poverty and, violence and dehumanization of others. And that is also part of the future. If we don't do anything now, that's going to be part of the future. It is in the present, and we have to act on it. So there is an element of transformative resistance here. So by resisting, by coming up with initiatives, by producing knowledge, they are conquering also avenues for political participation and representation. So they have been able to travel around the country and show this is our experience, and we have produced this music, and we have produced this, we have written these poems, and we have this sort of organization. So they have been able to be vocal about their processes and get some sort of, recognition, yeah. There you go. So then there's a set of values, right, present in the artifacts and how they label things and how they label pictures. And family is important because essentially when they had massacres, the men were killed and women had to deal with a broken social fabric, with children who did not have a father. So they were in charge of reconstructing the society, and they still do that to a large extent. Just an anecdote, I remember I was interviewing a woman at the time, and so she was there with the daughter and the husband, and she had to go to the doctor, and she said, well, Mama, I don't want to go with my dad, I want to go with you. And she said, well, but he is your father, and he shares responsibilities, so he's going to go with you now. And it was fascinating because she was doing that, and at the same time we were having a conversation, and she was cooking as well. So that's the role of women. Not saying it shouldn't be or it should be, it's difficult, right? But it's women proposing, this is something that we're going to share. This is not only my responsibility, we're in this together. Or, ideas of respect towards difference. So it's very strong, or respect towards the ecological impact, the environment, and how our actions have an impact in the environment as well. And they do, they actually do it by looking after the environment and inviting others to do so as well. So you see the educational element there is quite prevalent. Ideas of the future, which are essentially connected with their cultural values, with the protection of the land, with reparation, with justice, with avenues of participation, with infrastructure. A woman said, I remember she said, well, peace without hospitals is no peace. Peace without roads is no peace. So that's still a huge, challenge. And then something that we need to think is, I still have time right now. So what does that mean for us? What does that mean for me doing my work, teaching about peace and working with communities? And I think one of those is, well, as we said before, right, understanding that education has two phases and we need to choose. And that's attention, and I think that's interesting because it keeps us on alert, right? It keeps us there, paying attention, contemplating, but making choices, making decisions. It is important, as many of you have shown today, children producing artifacts, and women and men, and creating, and proposing ideas, and painting, and with that there is some sort of healing and search for meaning that Viktor Frankl already mentioned, back in the day, after surviving the Holocaust. It is about, it's about finding meaning. The tensions that exist, this is quite interesting, and I think this has to be, it's part and parcel of that research and the work around peace, and I love the fact that John today was very honest and he said, I had to remove myself. You encounter difficulties. And even when you study and you learn from them, you see that there are also tensions and difficulties there. That's fine. We need to be able to deal with conflicts, with better conflicts, really, with more sophisticated forms of conflict. Critical engagement with pedagogies, with politics of hate, with social media, with digital spaces that promote hate and dehumanization of others. Thinking about the futures, and I quite like the idea of futures because it's not one. Right? We do things with people, communities do things, but they open up for possibilities. Right? That's an interesting one. As we do when we teach, right? We propose, we do things with them, we work with them, we learn together, and things will happen in different ways, sometimes unthinkable ways. We, from education, need to provide the capacity to aspire. But I would like to say something about that, which is, in one of the presentations somebody said today, we make the walk walking, is it? By walking, which means we are in this, and some of the reflections today were about me doing the research or doing the teaching or working with this community to have learned. I am an educator as well. And I have to say, when I started doing my research, I said to them, I am here to learn. Because they were expecting me to teach them how to do things, and I said, no, this is not my role. I'm a learner, because you have done wonderful things, and I'm here to learn from you. And I think that was the possibility for me to actually learn and live an experience. And the methodology was ethnography and multi-sited, and actually, allowing me to understand their position in the world. Reflection and meaning, I like the word. I think this is one of the key big words for today. Meaning, searching for meaning, and education is political. It's never neutral. But also, nobody liberates anyone. So we're in this together. We're learning together. We're making sense of our humanity together. And it's good that we don't forget that, because that's our salvation together. That's part of the salvation. Not, as liberation anymore, but understanding that we're in this, that we're human. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
really skillfully pulled together strands from different people's presentations and brought those in. That was really well done. Thank you very much. We have got time for a couple of questions or reflections, thoughts. Yes, Alice. I've not got a mic.
That's all right, I've got a big voice.
I can repeat it.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I have a question about peace propaganda in Colombia. There's a book called Humankind that talks about that, about putting Christmas trees in the jungle and putting photos of gorillas when they were babies from their mothers with messages to kind of persuade them to come out and start fighting. And he presents it in a very inspiring way to say we can do peace propaganda, not military propaganda. I was interested in what your take on that from the point of view of storytelling with all the sort of risks of that.
Well, I don't know about this one, it sounds amazing, but what I have seen in Colombia is that emotion has been used, and you know, we live in an era of politics of emotion, right? It's directly hitting our nervous system and we get that reaction, and that's why, for example, the no in the referendum won. But then what we have is the efforts of people in communities, essentially, and young people producing those alternative narratives, right? That in a way show, well, you know, it's about people who live like us, people like us, really. Because one of the slogans to promote the no was Paez, sí, pero no así, which is like yes to peace, but not like this. And there were lots of lies. Emotion was, you know, there were rhetorical devices to confuse people. And I quite like that. John at the beginning today was like, why are we confused? And, you know, that is the strategy. So when people are confused, when they don't know what to do, then it's easy to get them to do what we want, right? Or what, you know, political sectors want. So I don't know much about that, but yes, there are lots of, you know, like people presenting alternatives to that sort of, you know, politics of hate.
Thank you for the question. Just take one more. Yes.
Since you talked about memory, I was just wondering what you thought about the practice of truth and reconciliation that has been utilized a lot in conflicts in Africa. Because the idea is that you have different memories because you have different perceptions of what actually happened, different ideas of truth. And since you mentioned that reconciliation is so important, and you also talk about Upper Rai's capacity to aspire, which is possible only when there's reconciliation. So, in your context, I think commemoration is really good. But commemoration and keeping those memories alive, like you said, sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not, because it keeps the conflict alive and people can't move on. So I was wondering what you thought about having people come together. You know, here it's like a visual collection of images or memories. Sometimes just letting out, you know, it has been very useful in some contexts. I was just wondering what you thought, whether it's possible or...
Yes, but it's very complicated. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples, and thank you for that question. Thank you for that question as well. It makes me think, actually. But with memory in particular, we have sometimes issues of revictimization. So I was doing some work with some women, and one of them in an interview, so we finished the interview, and then she said, I really need to tell you something, and which I wasn't ready for. And she said that she had, you know, she suffered from sexual abuse by a paramilitary member, and that she had been telling the story a few times in tribunals, and because that's part of the process, right? It's about the truth, and sometimes it is deeply painful for women, mostly, right? Because they have to give those accounts of sexual abuse, and you know. And she said, well, every time I tell the story, it really hurts. It pains me to have to tell them because, well, you know, it's a moment again that I experienced and had the trauma of it. So that's very complicated, but at the same time, well, you know, that's part of the tension of that sort of process. So we have the tribunal, we have the Tribunal for Justice and Reconciliation, which has done a wonderful job, right? Because many accounts of the conflict, and it was similar to what happened, for instance, in South Africa because the Tribunal of Reconciliation has been informed by what happened in Argentina, by what happened in Africa. So it's a very interesting and sophisticated process because they get the lessons from previous processes, right? And it's about having members of the guerrilla, members of the paramilitary telling, we killed this number of people and we have them in graves here and there and we did these and we had alliances with political sectors. So it's deeply painful, but it is necessary. Because think about Spain, for instance. At the time, they had this transition to democracy, and they didn't have any sort of process like this. And at the time, and even so, still they say, it's an example of a good process of transition. Well, they still have the cracks of that process because they never got to know what happened. And just a little hint of it, like in films like Almodovar's films, like sometimes they hint something and it becomes such an issue because it's something that people want to keep until they wrap. But yes, it's deeply, it's very enriching but deeply painful. If I answered the question.
Thank you for responding. I apologise, we didn't mic your question, so people might not have heard that, so we'll make sure we do for that properly. We're going to need to move to the breakout sessions now, and so we're straight into the breakout sessions.